Hello, welcome to the Bookcast Club. Today you have me, Jenny, coming from Norwich in the UK. You have Chris coming from Indianapolis in the States. And we also have Kristine from the Gilmore Book Club, who's coming to us from New York. So welcome, Kristine.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We're very, very excited to do this episode. Me and Chris especially, because we're massive Gilmore Girls fans.
Yay.
Yeah, we've got Kristine to come on to chat the Rory Gilmore book challenge. Also, we've picked one of the books off that very long list, and the second half of this episode will be about The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. But firstly, let's talk about Gilmore Girls and the Gilmore Book Club. Kristine, tell us about the Gilmore Book Club and how this very exciting project came about. You've already told me once, so you're going to have to tell me again.
Yes, I did. But I love it so much, I will tell it to you a second time, and for Chris. So I've always been a Gilmore Girls fan since it came out on cable, and you watched it every week in front of your TV, and raced to go to the bathroom in between commercials. That's not really a thing anymore. And I just fell in love with the show and the characters and how Rory was so smart and so different, and the show itself was so smart. And so that's something I really connected with and have watched it ever since on a rotating basis in between other shows. So I've always been a huge fan. And then a few years ago, I was looking for a New Year's challenge to do. I didn't want to do something physical because I had done that for a few years previously. And so I was like, why don't I finally get around to doing that Rory Gilmore reading challenge that I've seen and heard? And it's over 350 books, all mentioned on the Gilmore Girls show by any character, whether it's a title that they say or a character or a quote from the book. Fans have picked it up and compiled a list and are reading it start to finish. So it's a pretty epic challenge.
Yeah, that really is. Chris, you're a fan of the show, aren't you?
I am a very big fan of the show. The only thing, though, is that every time people talk to me about the plot of the show, I realize that it's been so long, and I watched it when so many reruns were running, when all the seasons got jumbled, that I actually have a very difficult time remembering the overarching plots of the stories, through the seasons. But it was always a huge comfort watch for me growing up. Me and my sisters would watch it all the time. It always felt really warm and cozy, and it is an incredibly intelligent show. I really don't think that we've gotten a sitcom since that kind of had that level of banter and really kind of rapid fire dialogue. Certainly not on network television. It was just a really great show. I loved it. And I never realized, actually, until I started seeing things about this book club, how many literary references there are in Gilmore Girls. But it is a very kind of literary show. It kind of expects the audience to kind of want to keep up with the smartness and the references and want to be engaged on that level, which is really cool.
I was saying that I was aware of the reading challenge, and because it's a list of books that is quite heavy on the classics, it's not one that I've ever really started, although I've read a lot off that list. But I have got the film, the movie version, so I do try and do that one, because obviously they make a lot of references to books, but they also make loads of references to movies. And before we started recording, we were saying it's quite difficult when you're watching the show to know which they're making reference to. So the book list and the movie list, I think, tends to kind of take from both of those mentions. So yeah, the film list is over 500 long, but I'm almost certain that some of them are references that Rory has made to a book, but I haven't gone back through all the episodes and verified what she's talking about. I could do if I wanted to reduce how many I want to watch, but yeah, I feel like 500 films is maybe a bit easier to do than 300 books, but still both quite epic challenges.
Yeah, they do overlap, and because they're both fan-made challenges, it's hard for even fans to decide which one they were referring to. So I think, mostly for Lorelai, she's kind of talking about movies, and Rory's mostly talking about books, but I feel like sometimes doing them both might make it easier. Like watching the War and Peace miniseries makes it so much easier to read the actual book because you kind of have the characters in your mind. So sometimes if people, I think, have a hard time with those classics, I'm like, yeah, watch the movie and then go back and read the book. And it feels a lot easier because you've connected with it in a different way. And then I think it'll help you go through the books a lot more quickly and easier.
So, Kristine, give us some idea of what books are on this list for anybody that doesn't watch the show and isn't aware.
Yes, it's incredibly all over the place, which is both really cool and a little odd at some points. But it has really pushed me out of my reading comfort zone, which I most times really like. It has everything from obviously the Virgin Suicides and In Cold Blood and Carrie and The Shining to Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and things like that. There are several children's books on there, Pippi Longstocking and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory they talk about. And then, of course, there are a lot of classic books, you know, Pride and Prejudice and Great Expectations, all the things that mostly Rory is reading at school. So that's kind of where they come along, and a lot of those classics. So there's definitely something for everyone, and probably something you haven't experienced, which is really nice. And if, you know, you're not feeling the horror area like I don't, I have the hardest time with thriller horror stories, then, you know, you move on to something else that is your speed, and you go through those and maybe come back to the other stuff later.
And how many of them have you read? Do you keep a running tally, don't you, of how many that you've read?
Oh yeah, I do. And most people do. And I've made a special tracker that will count them for you because, as we've mentioned, it's quite a lot of books to keep track of. So I have a spreadsheet that you can get on my website that will count it all for you. I've read, I think, 103 at this point.
Good effort.
And I started over again once I decided to do the challenge that I had read like 70 or 80 just being a reader and going through high school and college. But then I decided if I'm going to like do the blog and the challenge, I'm going to start over from zero, which hurt a little bit to go back. And I've worked my way there. So I'm kind of like almost a third of the way through.
Yeah, good effort. And you review them on Instagram as well, don't you?
Yeah, I review them and write personal essays, which I hope help people connect with the material better. Some of these are, you know, really relatable and easy to read, and I think people connect to them quite well, but people often think the classics are intimidating and hard to get through, and the way that we're brought up to read them is sort of in an academic way instead of a personal way of like, what do I think about this? And what would I do if I were in this situation? So hopefully the personal essays on the blog help people find their ways to relate to books on a personal level, and really think about them like that instead of like, you know, I will always remember a question on our test was, what was Darcy's annual income? And we were all like, who cares? But that was definitely a question on our high school test. And that's, you know, I don't think that is the benefit of reading books right there, is knowing people's fictional characters' net incomes.
Chris, how aware were you of this reading challenge? Because you must have read loads of it just through coincidence.
I honestly, I'm not going to lie, until I heard about your project, I had not really realized that this list had been compiled or anything like that. And I had been looking at the list, and what stands out to me is how many like relatively contemporary novels at the time are on the list that they were like just talking about, I guess, in casual conversation. Like, for example, How to Breathe Underwater by Julie Oringer, probably in my top 3 favorite short story collections. It was published in 2007. It's on the list, which is just a funny, like, I don't know. I find it interesting that they're not just referencing, you know, kind of the classic stuff. Like they were clearly keeping up with the contemporary literature.
Current at the time, because is 2007 not when they did the last season?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was
around about then, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that the list includes also the revival for Netflix.
It depends
it does.
on who you talk
Whose
to.
list?
I like to
Okay.
keep classic and revival separate. Like, I'll go after the revival
Okay.
list later. Some
She's a
people smash it all
purist.
together, and it's like 500 books, and I think that kind of blows people's minds. I'm like, that's maybe a little too much. But yes, there is a lot mentioned in the revival as well.
Now, when you go out and like read a book from the Gilmore list, are you able to pretty quickly find like what episode it was referenced in, or do you like try and figure that out, or do you just kind of like go with it?
Some of them I do know and remember. Some I just, go with it, and I'm like, somebody has written this down. There's one that I've gone on social media and said, like, I have read this book repeatedly. I have watched the show repeatedly. I have no idea where The Awakening by Kate Chopin appears in Gilmore Girls. It is on every single list. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to read it, but I don't know where it shows up. So sometimes it is a little bit of trust. But the majority of them, either I'm able to find or somebody has found within the series, and we can kind of track it down where it is. The hard one is where they just physically have the books. And so it's harder to see, like, what cover is that to some random book, who knows. Those are the hardest ones to pin down.
Yeah, because there's some of them like I'm looking at, and like for example, like they have Brick Lane by Monica Ali. Some of them work the like contemporary ones. I'm like, did they actually like work that into conversation, or was that like in the background? Like I'm so curious how that made the list. You know what I'm trying to say? So I think that would be like a fun Easter egg project too, going along with the reading itself.
You have to get out like your magnifying glass and really zoom in and see whatever they're holding that day.
I know watching it back, when I've watched some of the movies off the list and then watched the seasons back, you do start picking them up more once you've like watched them, and presumably the same when you've read them as well. But does mean repeat viewings of Gilmore, which is never a problem, but you do have to keep watching it to notice where they make the references. But I know that the movie one is made up of every time they're watching something, every time they like quote from something or reference something, and then every time there's like a movie poster in the background of any of the like shots. So I certainly haven't compiled this list myself, and I've definitely come across Tumblr sites that obviously somebody started the project and is doing it like really faithfully and like finding the episode that it was referenced in, and then suddenly the Tumblr will just stop and you think, yeah, I think they gave up. You've got other reading challenges on your website.
Yeah, I was going to say that next. That I think the way fans interact with Gilmore Girls, because the movie challenge and the reading challenge is really unique, and it's a really fun way that, like you said, you do keep going back to the show to be like, oh, I read that now, and I've seen that movie, and I get it. And so I wanted to expand that experience into other shows, into Gossip Girls, which I think probably has, from the shows that I've looked at so far, the most literature mentions, which I was kind of surprised by. But other shows as well, like Grey's Anatomy or White Lotus, that, the literature they mention in there. So I'm going through, when I rewatch some of my favorite shows or popular shows, and writing down all the mentions I can find so that people can sort of replicate this reading challenge experience with some of their other favorite TV shows that are still on the air or still very beloved.
Yeah, that's very cool. I saw Sweet Magnolias on there, which I do quite enjoy. But I couldn't
And
remember.
Gilmore.
Do they have a book club? I can't remember. Or do they just make references in it?
They just make references. There's the lady who owned the spa, the house that they turned into a spa. When she passes away, sorry if nobody has watched this, she wants to have free little libraries around the town. And so then they start building all these free little libraries, and like she leaves her books to the town so that whoever comes by can like take a book from her.
Oh, I see.
So
cool.
And they slip some in there, I think people reference literature more than they think they do, especially in our TV shows. And so when people look at it and they're like, oh, all of these are in there. They're talking about Macbeth and Hamlet and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's in there.
So I was going to ask more generally about reading challenges, and I feel like I might know Chris's answer to this. But do you, obviously, Kristine, you do participate in reading challenges, but Chris, are reading challenges something that you do very often?
It used to be something I did quite a bit. I would take place in a lot of different reading challenges. Most of them were kind of like social media driven, but I don't do it as much anymore. It's something I would kind of like to get back to, and I really like the Gilmore one, obviously. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of other like reading lists. I think like Pop Sugar is pretty well known they put out a whole bunch of different reading challenges and stuff. So I think they're a really fun way, especially if you're somebody that's trying to find a way to kind of like refocus your reading, and try and stay. It can kind of give you like starting places and stuff. But yeah, I have not participated in a reading challenge in much earnest in a few years, to be honest.
Yeah, I love reading. I wish I could do more reading challenges. Obviously, the Rory one takes up a lot of time. Plus, whatever I decide to read on the side, which is also a crazy amount. But I would really love to go through like an author's complete set of works as a reading challenge. I think I've hit, maybe 2 or 3 if they have a lot, but to just sit down and read everything and then maybe read a couple of books about them to really get an in-depth perspective on everything they've done and the works about them, I think would be really fun to do in the future.
Have you done that, Chris? I feel like that's something you might have done.
I have definitely like read entire like catalogs from an author, but I haven't then gone on to read more about them. Usually because the ones I have read like entire catalogs of are like contemporary authors where there hasn't been like a biography or something like that. Like I've read, like all of Ann Patchett's work and stuff, but no one's reading the biography of Ann Patchett. So so yeah, stuff like that. I have definitely tried to read like an author's whole collected work. Margaret Atwood is one that I'm really kind of desperate. I really want to read all of Margaret Atwood's books, which is funny because I've only actually read 2 of them, but I've like loved them so much that I've been like, this is an author that I will savor reading this entire backlist over the course of my life.
Yeah, I'm a list maker and a procrastinator, so I love making a list and I love setting myself a challenge and then I never stick to them because I'm old. I think I remember when the 1001 books to read before you die like list first came out, and I remember thinking, oh yeah, I'm gonna do that. I don't think I'll ever read that many books in my lifetime, but finding like loads of random forums where people had compiled like Excel sheets and stuff, like yeah, I guess that's the sort of original list that everyone was trying to give a go. But yeah, that didn't last very long, I have to say. My enthusiasm waned quite quickly.
Do you guys do the Goodreads challenge where you just set a number of books? It can be anything.
Yes, I love to set a ridiculous challenge number at the very beginning of the year. And I have all this motivation for like the first 3 months. And then slowly it starts to be like, you are 10 books behind. You are 11 books behind. You are 13 books behind. And suddenly I'm like, you know what? I'm happy with myself as I was. I don't need to change anything about myself. And I never get as high as I want to, but I do set the challenge every year.
I'm the opposite of that. Too. I set it really low so that at the end of the year I can be like, whoa, I totally blew that out of the water. It was awesome. It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm one for setting it lower and not setting myself a particularly stretching target, I have to say.
I more use it so that I remember what I've read in the year, because people will do like, what are the 5 best books you've read this year? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't remember what I was reading in January. So I like that it just at least keeps track of what I read.
Before we move on to the Virgin Suicides, I wanted to ask you, Kristine, what your favourite book that you've read off the list so far has been?
So far, I think it might be The Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood. I hadn't read it before. I think I had seen the movie a while ago and just didn't know what I was expecting with the book, and I really enjoyed it. And I think my personal reaction and things that I kind of discovered about myself made that book more important and better to me because of the experience that I had with it. So far, that's been one of the best ones.
Is that a YA book? I've never read it. Tell me if I'm wrong.
I want to say no. I don't think so. The movie is also really lovely. It has Sandra Bullock and Maggie Smith. Like, it's a great
Sandra
cast.
Bullock.
Yeah, in the movie.
Okay, I'm
both
on
are
it.
good. It's
Sandra
one of those
Bullock
ones where like both the book and the movie I think turned out really good.
This is where we pop a little ad break in to tell you about all the different ways you can support the pod, most of which are totally free. A really effective and easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. If you listen on Spotify, you can also very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media. We're at Bookcast Club on Instagram and TikTok. You can sign up to our free monthly newsletter on Substack, where we share even more book recommendations, our pick of the new releases, and all the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you want to support the podcast financially, we do have a Patreon account. You can sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, a close friends feed on Instagram, monthly bonus episodes, and our top tier will get you all of the above and personalized book recommendations. We get you to fill in a survey, and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We will also send you books in the post. There are over 30 bonus episodes you can get instant access to if you sign up as a patron today. We now also offer a 7-day free trial with our bonus tier. The link is in our show notes. But however you choose to show your support, we as always want to say a huge thank you. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners.
Okay, so book club time. Before we go on to discuss The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides, we thought we would just warn listeners that obviously we're going to be talking about a fairly difficult, traumatic subject, and so if you find the subject of suicide a sensitive one, then obviously feel free to skip this. I can't say that we're not going to be discussing it in detail, and I don't think we're going to be able to put markers into different parts of the conversation, so I think it's best skipped altogether if you need to. Please do look after yourselves, and if anybody does need help, then please call 998 in the US or the Samaritans on 116 123 in the UK if you need to talk to anybody. Moving on to book club. I can't remember how we chose this one. I feel like Sarah was originally going to do this episode, and she gave us a list of books, and we chose The Virgin Suicides. Now she's not here. But me and Chris are very keen to reread this one, because both of us have read it before. But just to give you a little plot summary, The Virgin Suicides is the story of the very short lives of the 5 Lisbon sisters and the boys who loved and worshipped them from afar. The book is narrated, I think, by a nameless teenage boy. I don't think we know his name. And he's almost narrating it on behalf of all the teenage boys in the town that they live in the neighbourhood that they live in. And it's a reflection on the lives of the people in that town, the political climate at the time. I think it's set in the 70s, and their obsession with the elusive and mysterious Lisbon girls. But plot-wise, there generally isn't much more to say than that, because I think it's fair to say that it's a fairly plotless book, other than this sort of driving force that is the suicide of the 5 sisters. First of all, what did you guys think of it? Did you enjoy it?
I am not quite finished with it, I must admit, but I have loved every second. It is really good, and it's really funny because I actually really did not like this book the first time. And I think I just didn't get it, and I was a much younger reader. I say much younger. I was like probably 22, 23 at the time. But still, I feel like I get it now in a way that I probably didn't then. And I think it's brilliant. It's darkly comical at times in ways that's unexpected, and really kind of takes you out. And there were times when I was like really laughing when I knew I shouldn't be. It's also a book that I think when you are young, I feel like you have this sense that everything has this almost mythical importance, right? So much has all this kind of like symbolic feeling. Everything kind of almost feels like the end of the world, right? And I think that sometimes when you grow up, you forget what that felt like, or what it was like to kind of live with that kind of crushing weight of that all the time. This almost like hyper emotional state. And this book made you remember that. state of mind, and to kind of live it again through this kind of collective recollection of these girls and their lives and deaths. It's really a strange feeling to encounter again.
That was very well said. I think really speaks to the heart and the style of this book. This was the first time that I had read this. So, and I hadn't seen the movie, so I was going in not knowing anything. I enjoyed the narrator because it was very darkly funny, and they're like, this is Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and Exhibit C, and we have kept these all very pristinely, but we'll talk about Exhibit C later or whatever. And I do think it lightens the novel because this has the potential to be really dark, really sad, really triggering, and it is in some spots pretty heavy, but just the way in the style that it's written, it does take you out of that, which I appreciated because I don't think I couldn't have gotten through, the first couple without being able to pull back a little bit from all of that emotion. And I do think it really, reminded me of being young and like everything means something, and you're trying to find yourself and you're trying to find the meaning in life and you're trying to find love and friends and get through school and deal with your parents. Like there's a lot going on, and sometimes you misunderstand things just because of your position in the world, and you attach some significance to something that was like, they just decided to drink this water today instead of the tea or whatever. Like just these really small things that sometimes we remember in a traumatic incident or, something that happened. We don't know what the significance of that really tiny thing was, but it meant a lot to us for some reason. And I think that really comes through in the novel. I liked reading it, but I don't think I would read it again just based on the subject. I think it's tough to deal with, and probably I'd want to stay away from the movie. I know you guys mentioned watching the movie. I think I would stay away of it just from the topic for me, but I do think it was a good book to read, and I'm glad that I read it and that we're discussing it.
I have read it before, and Goodreads tells me that was in 2008, and in my review I went, I don't understand this book. I don't see what the point is. And it's really funny. And I was 23 or 22 when I read it, and it's really funny rereading it again because this time around I feel like I really get it, and like you, Chris, I think it's brilliant. It's just, it really captures that sort of, not that I particularly want to be in the mind of a teenage boy, but it really captures that, innocence of childhood and how much you project at that age onto other people, and how, important you think everything is, and every decision you make, how important you think that is to your life. It's creepy how he captured that. I mean, he would have been a teenage boy at some point, but just how well he captures that thought process of a teenage boy. One of the things that did jump out of me though is some of the language in it is very dated. There's some instances in it, and I know they're teenage boys and that's why they're talking like that, because I'm sure teenage boys say things that are inappropriate today, but there's just some references in there now that if it was written in 2023 they just wouldn't have made it into the book. There's a few different sort of racial references and ableist references that just wouldn't make it in there today. Those are the only bits that really kind of jumped out at me as it being a book written 20 odd years ago. I don't know when it came out, actually, 1993. But I'm really loving it, and I think it's really beautifully written and just really clever. Really clever. I actually don't know how he kind of holds it. I mean, it is fairly plotless, but I don't know how he holds all the different trails of thought in his head, because it's narrated by this unnamed narrator. He's kind of talking on behalf of all teenage boys. He's very unreliable because he seems to have these interviews with people that know the ins and outs of everything that happened. So you get this full narrative of what has happened with these sisters, and ultimately you know that a lot of that probably isn't true, and it's all just recollection that probably didn't exist. So it's just a very good example of an unreliable narrator in fiction, I felt. Chris, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, I was going to say one of the things I kind of liked about it in the kind of collective narration was the way that towards the beginning of the book, they actually discover a diary written by Cecilia, who was the first girl of the girls that kills herself. Her suicide is actually, or her first suicide attempt is the opening of the book. And in this diary, what the boys discover is that it becomes difficult to distinguish the girls as Cecilia writes about her and her sister's lives and the mundanity of it. And yet the girls, despite the fact that what's being described in the diary is mundane, the boys are able to recognize that clearly it must be significant enough to the girls that they wrote it down, right? And yet they're clearly bored by it, and they also find it difficult to keep track of the sisters. They kind of exist in this almost like blonde, pink-lipped, amorphous cloud, right, of girlhood. And then as the novel goes on, what you discover is that the boys actually start to feel much, much more difficult to keep track of in the document that they're presenting. They're kind of whatever this collective narration is of this investigation later on in life to recollect and make sense of these girls' deaths later, they actually feel very difficult to keep track of. I don't think that the reader can reasonably be expected to keep track of all of the male voices that are around these girls' lives. And in fact, it's the girls themselves who start to kind of feel more and more focused. And so it feels like a shot in a movie where what you think is the focal point really fades away, and you start to see the true focuses, which is really interesting. I'm very interested, as a technical writing, how that was accomplished, because you don't notice it. It's very slow, I guess. I would say that kind of transfer of focus as the girls each kind of come into focus and you learn more about their personalities. I loved that. I absolutely loved that aspect of the book.
Have you read any of his other books? I haven't. This is still the only one I've ever read.
I think I own The Marriage Plot.
I haven't read the other one either.
No, I own Middlesex, but I've never read it. I looked up where this book is referenced in Gilmore Girls, and I think they're talking about The Marriage Plot. Middlesex. Rory would sigh upon being asked her opinion, or more likely self-electing to offer it up. It didn't measure up to the Virgin Suicides either, for that matter, but it has poignant moments, so that's where it's referenced in the TV programme. So you can see how fleeting some of these books are mentioned that make it to the list.
Yeah, it's pretty fast.
Funny.
Yeah, isn't it? I could really vividly picture where this was set, the era it's set in, and I think in my review originally in 2008, where I'm I didn't know what this was about, I didn't know what the point of it was. The suicides almost allow them to reflect on their own lives a lot and what's going on at the time. So they talk about the cemetery workers on strike and the fact that affects the burial of Cecilia, I think, and the Dutch elm disease affecting the trees. So at one point the girls tie themselves to the tree that's in their garden that's going to be cut down. And I really appreciated that this time round. I think the first time round I would have found that boring, but I think as my tastes changed as I've got older, and I quite like languid, slow, plotless books that are just kind of beautifully written. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed the setting of it. And part of the reason why we've recorded this now is obviously because Gilmore Girls evokes that kind of cozy feeling. But I felt like this book was quite cozy, if that's a weird thing to say about a book about suicide.
At moments,
but just the setting of it felt quite, just comforting, which is quite a weird thing to say.
I was going to say, there's something in it that reminds me of To Kill a Mockingbird, that these are all young people and something traumatic happens in their lives that changes who they are and the way they look at things. It clearly changed their town, that this was, a place people wanted to live. And by the end, the town is dying and people are moving out. Nobody wants to live there and all the trees are gone. And they look back and, there's a part at the end where they're kind of older men and saying every girl we met, we measured against the Lisbon girls. And when we were with them, we were still with the Lisbon girls, and, you know, still thinking about that, like sitting in that treehouse as an old man, still thinking about it, and like trying to piece it together and figure it out. And I don't think, you know, obviously we don't talk about this book the way we talk about To Kill a Mockingbird, but I think it still has that sort of, you know, coming of age, especially with something really traumatic happens, the way that changes you and how it really stays with you.
Yeah, and I was going to say about the kind of, because you're right, there is a certain like kind of familiarity and coziness, or lack of a better word. There's like this warmth in the novel and the atmosphere that it creates that is very difficult to deny. And I think that's actually quite a intention. Like I think especially if you grew up in suburbia, like it's very much designed to kind of put you back in that kind of very claustrophobic, tight-knit suburban life, you know? So in that sense, it has that familiarity comforting, right? But then juxtaposed to that, of course, is this like looming tragedy that's taking place in these girls' house, you know? And it's that kind of thing that you have to confront in the novel, this horrific stuff going on alongside the kind of mundane high school life, and the way that this is, you know, like you said, I was at auto worker strike because that's what's going on in the news. And I meant to say the cemetery strike, because it oddly plays important details and different stuff like that. You know, looking back on the different ways that, like, because I think the book, it never exactly says when it's set, like what time, but you can kind of piece together that it must be like 60s to 70s, because it talks about like the men being in World War II, the fathers and stuff like that. So it is very much like a boomer era adolescence kind of burgeoning into the 60s and 70s. Where was I going with all that? But anyway, the point is that, you know, you have that era, which I think kind of lives on in the American consciousness as this kind of like warm era that I think some people wish we could return to, alongside this horrible tragedy taking place with this family. And in fact, at one point, there's a woman ends up writing an article into the local newspaper, basically asking that we take a look at the what's plaguing our young people, so that they suicide. And then they find the woman who wrote the op-ed later on. They interview her, and actually she wasn't even that concerned about the girls. She was just more upset because the house was looking deteriorated on the street, and, you know, we got to keep the property values up. We're not terrible people around here. It's just kind of shocking, you know, the way that kind of plays together.
I don't think it could have been narrated by anyone else other than those teenage boys. I feel like obviously he very carefully chose that narrative, because we wouldn't be talking about it as a sort of warm book and a humorous book if it wasn't written from that naive perspective of these teenage boys. And I think, you know, there's elements of it that bring up a lot of nostalgia, I suppose. I mean, I'm from the UK, so we didn't really particularly do prom, and it's not prom that they go to, is it? Homecoming? I don't even know what that is, but it sounds
a very
fun.
big deal.
It's the first home game.
Oh, okay, I knew it was something to do with football.
Yes, and then, you know, the dance that goes with it.
If it hadn't been written from that age group, it would have been a totally different book. It would have been a much sadder book. And they have that naivety that they are not assuming what goes on behind closed doors, which is adults with trauma in your past and just having a bit more life experience. We wouldn't have that innocent thought that they do, which I think you're presented with a lot. I mean, I'm not entirely... They talk to you as if they're presenting fact, but a lot of it is them kind of like making up stuff, basically, and just imagining what's going on behind closed doors.
I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because I think this book is a lot about the kind of huge gap in understanding between yourself as a young person and yourself as an adult, right? Because at one point in the book, I think it was Cecilia, when she was first under examination during her first suicide attempt in the opening chapters, she talks to a doctor, and he says, well, you know, you're not even old enough to realize how bad life gets. And here you are trying to kill yourself. And he says it in this way, it's kind of flippant and stuff. And she responds with, well, then you have no idea what it's like to be a teenage girl. And that like gap in understanding is very fascinating. And actually, I underlined there was a part in this book that I underlined because I was really struck by it, where they had published the local television show had published a interview series with a bunch of teenagers who had attempted suicide and had survived their attempts, and had gone to therapy, and now they came back to explain themselves. And it says their answers sounded rehearsed, relying on concepts of self-esteem and other words clumsy on their tongues. One of the girls, Rainey Jolson, had tried to end her life by baking a pie full of rat poison so that she could eat it without attracting suspicion, but had served only to kill her 86-year-old grandmother, a lover of sweets. At this point, Rainey broke down weeping. The host consoled her, and we were into a commercial. And it's just like this inability of them, even after the attempt, to put into words or vocalize the mental state that led them to this. And in fact, the things that they do say, sound like something they've been rehearsed to say, to learn after it's been healed. But I don't think you can truly understand that point unless you're living in it in the moment, I think.
I have that same exact passage where Cecilia goes to the doctor. She's like, you have no idea what it is to be a 13-year-old girl. And I think several of the quotes that I marked there's one that says, we felt the imprisonment of being a girl, the weight it made your mind active and dreamy, and how you ended up knowing which colors went together. So I feel like there is this adolescent, like not children, but also not adults, and coming to terms with all of that and like what it is to be a child and to think that way. But you're sitting here as the reader, like you're reading into everything that's going on between the lines that these kids aren't saying. And that's in the back of your mind. But, they're going from that to like, we have to go to school, but then here's this really dark thing that happened, but now I have to do my homework. So it is, kind of a random jumble of thoughts for them all to go together.
Well, it's just like the quote I just read, and we were on to a commercial break, mm-hmm. There is this sense that you take a moment, you reflect on this horrible grief, and then you move on. And at one point, the school that they're in decides that they want to hold a day of grief for the students. Day. And it was one of the most cringe-inducing things I've ever had to read, especially because the father of these girls, and this was actually only after Cecilia's death, so none of the other girls had even died at this point. And it's so cringe-inducing. And he works at the school, so he has to be present for this day of grieving that is obviously about his dead daughter. And there's a convocation that's had, and it's just the funniest thing. It says, Mr. Headley, the English teacher who rode his bicycle to school with his trouser cuffs secured in metal clips, handed out a collection of poems by the Victorian poet Christina Rossetti. Deborah Frentel remembered a few lines from one poem entitled Rest. O earth, lie heavily upon her eyes, seal her sweet eyes, weary of watching. Earth, lie close around her, leave no room for mirth with its harsh laughter, nor for sound of sighs. She hath no questions, she hath no replies. The Reverend Pike spoke of the Christian message of death and rebirth, working in a story of his own heart-rending loss when his college football team failed to clinch the division title. It's just a complete, embarrassment of people on two ends of the spectrum trying to relate to grief, either through these ridiculous, Victorian era poetry that none of these kids are going to probably resonate with, or through these, stories that don't even approach the grief that they might be feeling. It's a complete kind of almost breakdown of their suburban comforting society to actually do anything about this.
Super, super crunchy moment. And they only did it because they thought maybe they needed it. Was way, way past when they should have done it. And they just, were kind of forced into it. But side note, a poem from Christina Rossetti actually shows up in Sweet Magnolias, because we talked about that earlier. So I wanted to bring that up. It's a different poem, but yeah, when they read that, I was like, oh my gosh, somebody read another Christina Rossetti poem at a funeral in Sweet Magnolias.
It's a good poem, but it's just a hilarious thing to be passing out at a convention several months after this girl has killed herself.
But you reading that passage out and then you reflecting on it shows how starkly the narrator is literally just presenting it as fact to you. and they're not reflecting on it, and that is what makes the book quite funny. Even though it's dark, it is very darkly humorous, and that was a brilliant example. Yeah, I just really loved it. I really enjoyed it, and I didn't. Well, maybe I did think I was going to. I feel like I definitely thought it was a book I hadn't understood when I originally read it, and that's why I was keen to reread it, because he's a brilliant writer. I'm kind of in awe of his writing.
I loved the collective we narration. I just think that had to have been such a technical challenge to do.
Yeah. How he kept track of that, that's what I was saying. Just like amazing, really.
And it doesn't feel like it was like nothing about it feels like forced or difficult or contrived. Like it really feels like the natural way that the story had to be told, which is impressive because it's not a natural storytelling voice very often.
Did you guys watch the movie?
I've never seen it.
I watched it today. The film of the Virgin Suicides is directed by Sofia Coppola, who is my favourite director of all time. It's one of her early films, but it's very much in her style, and it works really well. She's quite faithful to the book, and her style of film, if you've seen any of her other movies, she did Lost in Translation and Marie Antoinette and The Beguiled, and her style is very languid, very ethereal, very soft, very beautiful. And it very much suits this book. It isn't a difficult watch, and the suicides are dealt with very much, in the most part, off screen. And like the book does, it very much focuses in on the teenage boys. So I wouldn't be put off by the subject matter. It is done in a very kind of ethereal manner that makes it watchable. She's very careful with the content. But yeah, it definitely suits her as a director. However, I do, even though I love her, I think that the book is superior, but it is worth watching.
I didn't realize that she was the one that did The Beguiled, and I loved that movie.
Now that you mention all of her
tone.
movies together, I think really made me see how she could take this and put it on the screen, just thinking of all her other movies. But I do, I feel like a lot of people would agree that in most scenarios, the book is better. Because how can you get that?
Yeah.
All of the quality of that narration and the detail and the inside look at everything books are very hard to translate to the screen.
They are, and just the writing as well. Like if you want to read something with really beautiful writing in, I've tabbed a few bits. Let me just check what I've tabbed. Probably passages I liked. Family members acting as caretakers had made touching attempts to spruce up loved ones' final resting places. Excessive fertiliser had scorched one plot blazing yellow. Excessive watering had turned another into a marsh. Because water had to be carried in by hand, the sprinkler system had been sabotaged. A trail of deep footprints from grave to grave made it appear the dead were walking around at night. And it was just so clever. I just found all of it just those little details I just thought were really beautiful in it, even if they were dark and creepy.
If you want some just incredibly funny, sharp turns of phrase too, like there was one point in time when Audrey Hepburn got mentioned, and it said something along the lines that somebody was very stiff like Audrey Hepburn, whom all women idolized and men never thought about. And I just thought like that line was so like it really got me. It's just like the funniest little like sharp little observation, and the book is just peppered with that. Like it's a feast of little bits like that you can just kind of absorb and just be like, you can't believe how funny, oddly, and beautiful he's able to make some of these themes, which I think you have to if you're going to write something this dark. Which I will say also, it turns out, because the whole time I was reading this book, I was like, don't get me wrong, not to say that suicide isn't unrealistic. Obviously it is. But I did feel like, the way this kind of came about, I was like, man, 5 of them, just seems harsh. But then I read that he was actually inspired because his nephew's teenage babysitter told him that she and her sisters had a pact to kill themselves. And I was like, oh my God, you know what I mean? Like, that's just horrifying, actually, how close to reality what might seem like a hyper reality in the novel actually is. The way it's captured in this book is very smart and warm and lyrical and funny and kind of captures all the strange emotions that might arise out of such a horrible tragedy in a way that I have never experienced before in literature.
I agree. And I'm looking forward to reading his other books just because of the way this one is written. And Middlesex has been on my TBR for a really long time, so maybe I'll get to it sooner rather than later.
Me too. I feel like I bought them at the same time, and Middlesex has also sat on my shelf for 20 years. But because I read this one, I was like, that was hard work. I hadn't read it, whereas now I just kind of want to pick it up straight away.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely loved it.
He also wrote a short story collection, and I remembered when it came out because I remembered that it got like not super great reviews, but I want to read it. It's called Fresh Complaint. This is the other one of his. He actually hasn't written that many books for having written such a blockbuster of a debut.
Me coughing. Was this his debut?
This one.
Mm-hmm. And it was also Sofia Coppola's directorial debut.
Oh, there you go. It felt early Sofia Coppola, and it looked very early 2000s.
Some very big names were born from this story.
Yeah.
I absolutely loved it, and I'm really glad I read it, and I'm also wanting to read a lot more on the Gilmore Girls Reading Challenge, and I'm also now going to want to watch Gilmore Girls and write down every single literary reference that I hear, because that's insane. I mean, I always knew it was a lot, but well over 400 is wild.
It'll keep you busy, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any recommendations that you feel go alongside this one?
I do. The Van Apfel Girls Are Gone. It's a thriller. It is very similar. It is, in my opinion, 100% an intentional response to the Virgin Suicides. It follows 3 girls in Australia who disappear one day from a bonfire, never to be found again. It's most likely that they just chose to walk into the woods and never come out. And it is a woman reflecting on her childhood with these 3 girls and what actually happened to them. And they were from a very repressive religious family, kept under lock and key, very similar to the way that the Lisbon sisters are.
And what was that called again, Chris?
It is called The Van Apfel Girls Are Gone.
So I kind of thought along the teenage boy vein, Stephen King writes a lot of stuff from, and he writes very well from a teenage boy perspective. So if you enjoy that side of this book, then it is written from the perspective of a group of teenagers, and Stand By Me is obviously, I think the film is called Stand By Me. I think the short story is called The Body by Stephen King, which is obviously written from the perspective of teenage boys. And then film-wise, it's not the same tone whatsoever, but there's a film called Now and Then. I don't know if you've seen it, with Christina Ricci. It probably came out in maybe the early 2000s, late 90s.
So I have not seen the movie, but I really love the soundtrack. I think it was something that my mom had, and I just really loved the music. So I am familiar with it.
It's either set in the 60s or 70s. So yeah, the soundtrack's very good, and it's about teenage girls, but it's from their perspective. And I think maybe they're trying to look into a murder or something. So yeah, I love that film. There's a movie for you. Tonally very different, but it gave me the same kind of teenage vibes.
Yeah, I immediately thought of, also by Stephen King, Carrie, which is written in a very scientific, here's a clipping in the newspaper, and here's what the psychoanalyst said, and here's what there are just a lot of exhibit A, exhibit B kind of thing. So all of that is written into, even though it's focused on Carrie, it's written as a very scientific, factual kind of book. So that was really similar to me. And then In Cold Blood has the same element of, it's about a murder of an entire family, but still has that kind of small town vibe. That one actually is based on a real life murder that happened. And so like those sort of had similar elements to me. And both are on the Rory Gilmore reading list.
There you go. So you can tick them off. Thank you for coming on, Kristine. Where can people find you?
You can go to my blog, and that's where all of these reading lists are, and the trackers as well, gilmorebookclub.com. And all of my socials, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, all the things are Gilmore Book Club.
And definitely check out the blog. It is so impressive, that website. It's
very impressive.
Yeah, it's really
Thank
cool.
you so much.
Chris is going to be busy.
I know. I'm mostly obsessed with anybody that can like do websites this well. I'm just like, I tried one time and failed very badly.
Well, there you go. Go check out Kristine's website, and thank you for listening. As ever, there are loads of ways you can get in touch with us with any questions, ideas, feedback, recommendations. You can email us on thebookcastclub@outlook.com, or you can contact us on Instagram or TikTok, where we're at bookcastclub. You can sign up to our newsletter on Substack for more reviews, new releases, podcast recommendations, and the latest updates on the podcast. Please go and check out our Patreon, where you can get a 7-day free trial of our bonus tier, and obviously go and check out Kristine at Gilmore Book Club. And thanks once again for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.